You're listening to the Threadwork Collective on air. I'm your host, Leona Jean Manabog, artist, educator, and community builder. This show is where art meets activism, where local voices share the causes that matter to them, and where storytelling becomes a bridge toward understanding and belonging. We highlight the power of creative expression, grassroots action, and healthy dialogue to strengthen our communities. Because shared stories create shared futures. Welcome to this week's edition of the Threadwork Collective. This week we have got our guest, Dr. Estee Crenshaw. She is an English professor at Utah Valley University, and she's hopping on tonight to talk about rhetoric and its function in our democracy, basically, and lots of other things. She's a really interesting human. So,
Well, thanks. I'm happy to be
well,
here.
yeah, welcome, Estee. Or should I say Dr. Crenshaw?
No, let's stick with first names. This is
All right, fair. Well, um, I guess to kick it off, I always like to have my guests just introduce themselves, give a little bit of background as to who you are, what you do. What would you say your story is?
well, as you said, I'm an English professor right now at Utah Valley University. I teach classes ranging from first year composition up to upper division rhetoric and rhetorical theory classes. That's where my interests lie, in particular within multicultural rhetorics. And I study my personal research, I guess, revolves around pre-modern Japanese rhetoric and early Japanese poetry. So that intersection between rhetoric and poetics is where I'm really interested in.
Super cool. And that's actually how we met, was a class on learning how to teach rhetoric back in
That's
grad
right.
school.
Yeah, many years
It
ago.
was good times. I recognized how ripped Estee's forearms were because we were sitting in a class, or no, I think it was a final um closing kind of session for the day, and I had just gotten a little bit more into like programmed weight training, and so I was primed, and I looked over and Estee's like grabbing something out of her backpack, and I'm like, oh my god, her forearms are so buff. And that was the start of a now, what is it, like 7, 8 year friendship?
Yeah, maybe more than that.
So
That was a long time ago, needless to say. The forearms are not as ripped these days.
Um, cool. Well, thank you for hopping on. And rhetoric is something I've talked about here on the show before. But it's a term that I like to take some time to define for the audience. So, breaking down rhetoric into basic layman's terms, how would you tell a listener what that is?
I think the go-to definition would be the art of persuasion. That's kind of what people fall back on. Obviously, with most of these kinds of concepts, it gets more complicated than that, especially in the different iterations that rhetoric takes in different societies and cultures and what persuasion looks like within those. But I think the art of persuasion is maybe just a good starting point.
Yeah, cool, cool. Why is this something? I mean, you still teach this now among other courses, but how do you pitch to your classes and how would you tell the audience here, like, why this is worth studying?
I think the only way to understand the world is from a rhetorical perspective. And that's because the way that humans operate is primarily through language, the way we communicate, the way we get things done. And so, understanding how language works, how interpretation works, how people use language in different ways, I think is essential to a society running at all.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I mean, it's interesting because having taught as well, it's one of the things that I feel like I see students would ask all the time, like, why do I need to take a writing course? Why do I need to take a rhetoric course? I don't want to be an author. I'm going into some kind of science or engineering or, fill in the blank field. This feels like a waste of time.
Yeah, I hear that as well. I say if you're human, you should have some working knowledge of rhetoric. And of course, within the Western tradition, at least, rhetoric used to be the bedrock of education. Everyone, if you were a citizen, that is, was educated in rhetoric because you needed rhetoric in order to participate in your society. And I think there's a lot to be said about the lack of rhetorical skills nowadays and what that has resulted in terms of American society and democracy.
Would you say, I mean, so it's the art of persuasion in essence, but would you also say that learning how to wield rhetoric could be characterized as just knowing how to effectively communicate?
Yeah, oftentimes it's related as such. If you want another term, then eloquence is often used. Just the ability to, as you said, communicate effectively in the positive sphere of that. That's to communicate ethically as well, though we don't always see that. And that's why rhetoric these days does seem to have a little bit of a negative reputation with phrases like, oh, that's just rhetoric or it's empty rhetoric, because people who are in positions of power, they get there because they understand the power of rhetoric. And so sometimes that can turn into a negative thing, but that's not inherently negative. I think it's as much positive, but it does come down to that effective communication.
Yeah. Well, I like that you highlight that. I think it is something that typically has more of a negative connotation now with empty rhetoric or it's just rhetoric. But I do think it is a net neutral skill set and it just is contingent upon how it's being employed. So it is extremely effective and it is something that can like create action or change or power acquisition,
Mhm.
actually, or even power like reallocation, really.
Oh, I like that, yeah.
But the overall outcome of that being a net positive or a net negative event is dependent on who is wielding that. So
Mhm.
I think one of the things that sticks out to me in hearing you talk about that then is um in relation to like this concept of democracy and having a functioning society is that if we have individuals wielding rhetoric, we need to make sure that we have enough individuals coming to the table and wielding rhetoric to hopefully net positive to like help balance out some of the tumult. I don't know, thoughts.
Definitely. And if you don't know anything about rhetoric and you think all language is equal, or you look at language at face value, then you're one of those people who could easily be taken advantage of by somebody who does understand language and rhetoric. And so it's important, even if you don't see yourself as someone who wants to become a politician or in some field that uses rhetoric specifically, you will still be around and participate in a society where that exists, and being able to understand certain rhetorical appeals or the ways people try to persuade you, especially today with marketing, advertising, all of these things are so prevalent that if you're not aware of the ways that they work on human psychology, then you're more susceptible to be taken advantage of.
Yeah, so you talked about how in Western society, this was the bedrock of education, and that this was essentially how society functioned. How would you bridge that over to what you're seeing in American society now and kind of like the way social and political and like even community issues have kind of evolved over the last few decades, I'd say is fair to characterize right now?
Well, there's a lot in that question. I think if we look back to the beginnings of democracy, which is often traced back to ancient Athens, then we see that rhetoric was the bedrock of education because it was essential in this society for people to communicate their desires. And because this was the first time, really, in Western civilization where we had um, rule by the people, right? That's what democracy means, and power to the people. And so people had to decide what to do, and this was largely determined by majority vote. So if you could convince enough people at the assembly, this is what we should do. We should go to war with Sparta. We should not. We should do it this way. We should build this temple to Athena. We should, whatever it may be, being able to persuade others so that you had the majority vote was essential. Now we see that even today, we have remnants of this in our education system where in general education students are required to take usually a kind of first year composition course, and in that course, at least in the ways I've seen it taught here in Utah, it revolves around rhetoric, maybe indirectly, sometimes more directly. And students are required to learn certain things like the rhetorical appeals. You've maybe heard those phrases, ethos, pathos, logos, these, early Greek terms that relate to the ways that people would use language in order to enact change in their environment. So we have a kind of vestigial understanding of rhetoric still today, but our democracy is also very different. So there's so many things that we have to take into account when kind of tracing this history. So I'm not sure if I can fully, I mean, I can keep talking, but this is a multifaceted issue.
Yeah, well, and I want to keep exploring it. We don't have to necessarily lay it all right now because I think for this first section, we're kind of just give a high level view of what we're going to talk about, and then we'll dig in a little bit deeper as we go to some of our other segments. But yeah, the whole point of this podcast is just getting to like explore these ideas and hopefully we'll have you back on the show again at some point. We can dig into certain things a little bit more deeply, but for this first one, it's just kind of like a really high level look at like how effective communication plays in, where some of the breakdowns are happening as we see them. And then I mean, we focused a lot on in particular like Greek and Western philosophy, but your space of study actually wasn't in Western rhetoric necessarily, right? Your dissertation specifically was on.
Right. My dissertation was in the field of comparative rhetoric. So, although there is that kind of background or backdrop of Western rhetoric, I specifically looked at rhetorical practices in pre modern Japan. And of course, anytime you're looking at a tradition outside of the Western sphere of understanding rhetoric, you say, well, what do we mean even by that term anymore if this is a Greek term in origin? um, what exactly are we looking for? So then we fall back on this idea of persuasion or effective communication, and we see that different societies, because they have different cultures, different epistemologies or ways of understanding the world and interpreting things, that they use language differently, or that language use maybe looks different in order to be persuasive. We have some cultures, Japanese culture in particular, that is very context driven, and so there's a lot that's not said, and you have to take that into account when understanding what does it mean to be effective in this society.
I mean, and for me, the question that raises up then is if we have all these different cultures coming to the table, looking to have effective discourse and utilize communication to the end of creating hopefully a shared understanding of compromise or common societal goals in some ways. I mean, this is a question that there isn't an easy answer to, but like, how do we start to bridge that gap in a place where we have so many different groups and so many different backgrounds and ways of communicating?
Yeah, that's a great question. And of course, with the advent of the internet, this is the ever prevalent question, right? We have so many different peoples coming together in a shared space, and there are frictions that occur, right? And not all of that is due to cultural differences, but there are ways that communication has become somewhat standardized in a way online. Of course, English has taken the kind of dominant stage, but English has not always been the dominant language. And so with it, I think maybe we're falling back to some of the Western tradition, but at the same time, people are not educated on rhetorical tactics. Yeah, that's a great question. And of course, since the advent of the internet, this has been even more prevalent, right? We've seen that many different kinds of peoples are coming together. So, how do we communicate effectively in a multicultural sphere? Well, one thing we find is that there has to be, I think the word you used was compromise as well, right? There has to be some kind of compromise in terms of what we're appealing to. Turns out that it is actually quite difficult um, to come to some kind of agreement when you don't have any shared cultural artifacts, so to speak. Even in the classroom today in Utah or in Utah, if you say to students, let's think about this dialogue of Plato or something. Nowadays, that might sound quite obscure. You might have to make a reference to something more contemporary that everybody would be familiar with in order for there to be any kind of shared understanding of the illusion you're trying to make or something. And we find when we study cultural or rhetoric from different cultures that this is kind of one of the things that makes rhetoric work is having a shared kind of cultural artifacts or understanding that you can fall back on and appeal to.
Yeah, well, it's one of the things that I remember thinking often, like in the classroom, as just like a basic principle of teaching, but I think is also a basic principle of how to build any kind of relationship is that the human mind likes the familiar.
Right.
So if you can create a foundation first of the familiar, and then from that familiar, yeah, bridge the gap over into this unknown concept. That's where you have that success because there's some way to enter in.
Yeah, and for the Greeks, I mean, the Greeks all knew Homer, right? The Iliad, the Odyssey, these myths that had been passed down orally and then codified into writing. Before the Greeks had jurisprudence or a legal system that was codified into law, they didn't have maybe specific laws at the beginning, but they would appeal to Homer, right? They would say, "Hey, this is how Odysseus, in this part of the Odyssey, handled this situation," or "This is what Agamemnon did," or this, and that would be the precedent for the legal case. And I think the same thing happens today. We appeal, I mean, the legal system, you could argue today, is kind of appeals back to other mythologies. And I mean that word broadly speaking, myths, things like Christianity, the Bible. These are the ideas that have been passed down that become the kind of shared culture um, that gets turned into law to some degree.
Yeah, well, I think you're hitting on a really interesting tension because I think you're right. That is the foundation of a lot of the laws and like the way a lot of different, well, government officials and then like governing bodies make their decisions. But I think more and more we're starting to see critique of that as the touchstone,
For sure.
which I think is for good reason because of this whole premise is it, and I say this from a place of not being anti-Christianity or anti-religious, but like the idea being that if we need that shared touchstone upon which to like come together and have an understanding, if we are basing that on a touchstone that not everybody buys into or agrees with, we right out the gates already have a significant issue in how we're able to communicate with each other.
Yep. And you're right. That's why we're seeing a lot of the tensions we are today because there is friction within that, right? We did have in America a kind of decrease in religiosity, but now we're seeing quite a rise in religiosity and the kind of neo-Christian beliefs, and they're becoming very closely tied to politics. Not that they were never separated for sure, but we do see that. And of course, if not everyone's on the same page, that does result in some kinds of friction.
Welcome back. This is the Threadwork Collective, and we are talking to Dr. Estee Crenshaw.
Wow.
and wanting to pick up where we left off, we talked a little bit about how rhetoric is an important foundation um, just within our social and political spheres. We talked. You also mentioned rhetorical appeals. For a lot of our listeners, it's probably been a minute since they visited their intro to rhetoric classes in college. So, can you break down just really quickly what rhetorical appeals are and why we talk about them in this context?
Of course, yeah. So when we're talking about rhetorical appeals, this is coming from Aristotle. He was the first to write down all of these things about rhetoric and to try to categorize it like he did many other things, categorize these concepts. So ethos is an appeal to authority or credibility. I guess I should say first that the what we mean by rhetorical appeals are things that people appeal to or refer to in order to convince an audience. Things that because of our psychology as humans tend to be effective on us. So we as humans tend to believe and trust people who have shown that they are trustworthy, who have integrity. That seems to be something that's just innate in being human. And so we call this the appeal to ethos, to one's authority or credibility, right? So if you are an expert in a topic, we say, well, we maybe trust what you have to say more than we would trust somebody who has never heard of ABC, right? Then we have logos, which is an appeal to logic or reason or argument. Right? If you can demonstrate by laying out a first premise, a first idea, and connect it to the next idea, to the ABC, then we can say, okay, I can follow your reasoning. This seems to make sense. Therefore, it is convincing. That would be logos. And then pathos, in a nutshell, is an appeal to emotions. So, as humans, we experience emotions. Um, we can be made to feel happy, to feel sad. And it turns out that that emotional energy can be used in order to incite action or thought, belief, right? And so people use this appeal to emotion to try to make you maybe here's an advertisement for a sad puppy that needs to be adopted. This will make you feel sad. So you will feel, I need to do something about that. I need to take action. So this is what we call an appeal to pathos or an emotional appeal.
Yeah, whenever I think about that emotional appeal, it just Sarah McLachlan starts playing in my head right away. The Arms of the Angels. I'm like, that is wild that that commercial was so effective because there is literally nothing given. There are no reasons. There are no claims and reasons given. It's literally just sad puppies in like soggy cardboard houses and it's raining
Yeah.
and Sarah McLachlan is playing. And those commercials ran for a long time because they were very effective.
Yeah, and music is hugely effective in terms of accessing the emotions. Music and images, right? They say a picture is worth 1,000 words. Seeing an image of something is also very effective in evoking the emotions, and we refer to this as visual rhetoric.
Yeah, well, and I think that's a really interesting point to bring up because to me it highlights one of the premises of this show, which is that art and activism have typically intersected with one another because of a lot of things, but one of those main points being that music and art, any medium of art really can help capture and evoke a particular emotion that can create an empathetic experience or that can help people recognize why change needs to happen or why they should care for this group of people who's receiving some kind of abuse or the list goes on and on and on. But I do think it's super fascinating how I think in Western culture we tend to look at emotion and put it below logic in the way we process the world. And I do think that we're starting to see a little bit of a pendulum swing in the other direction with that. I think we're starting to be more aware of our emotions, but it still tends to be put below, I think, logical processing with regards to what we value as like a valid argument point or um, relevant in a conversation.
Right.
And like interestingly enough, though, advertising and marketing, I mean, sales is the same way. My early 20s did door to door bug sales, and one of the things that they taught was that if you can evoke an emotion, you want to like evoke an emotion in the person whose door you're knocking because they will buy. Like they would say, if you know they're scared of spiders, say spider every other sentence, and like they will buy because you're going to be putting that into mind for them, and they're going to get uncomfortable. That made me uncomfortable because I felt manipulative, but that to that point, emotion mobilizes.
Totally. I mean, think of McDonald's trying to logically propose an argument for why you should come get their latest Big Mac and fries, right? That's not their avenue, and they know that emotion is more effective, right? Emotion, appetite, and of course, activism is all about getting people to act.
Mhm.
And again, the emotional appeal is the strongest, I would argue, because it does have that energy attached to it, right? You can get kind of riled up for a good cause, whereas if you lay out premise by premise an argument in a reasonable fashion, it might be interesting, it might inform you in a certain way, but it doesn't seem to have the same emotional or energetic impact. It doesn't necessarily make you want to get out there and do something.
What's the balance, though?
So that's a great question. I read a study a long time ago, and now it's going to be an anecdotal thing because I'm not going to be able to cite it. But I did hear that logos tends, well, let's say pathos, as I said before, the appeal to emotion is the strongest appeal in terms of the quickest turnover in persuasion, right? That if you want to get somebody to do something, you try to get at their emotions, right? You talked about doing door to door sales. How do you get people to buy? Well, you say you're afraid of spiders, right? Bring that up. However, what do we know about emotion? We know that emotion passes, right? It has kind of a bell curve arc where you say you can get people's emotions to rise, but they don't stay peaked forever. They will eventually taper down. And so if there is no logical core or good argument for why someone should be feeling that way, then it's not going to have any long term benefit, right? And so I think this carries over into activism because we want to do more than get people riled up, right? We want to give them a reason and an avenue and a kind of structure, an argument that they can use in order to enact change and to put that energy into action.
Yeah, I like that. And I think there is something to it's something that I think about a lot because it's really interesting as I've looked over my own course of learning and like revising ideologies or entire frameworks of how I've seen the world. And I don't know that I could like pinpoint a particular combination. And when it comes to emotion, emotion is like a really tricky one because our emotions are always there for a reason. But I feel like sometimes as human beings, we don't know like the subconscious reason behind an emotion at times. And so when I look at, I mean, going to like a concrete example, when I look at emotional appeals and how they play out in like the public arena, we see it all over the place like, on social media and the news right now, but that's not new. I think it's gotten worse, but, like, going back over history, there's a lot of appeal to emotion, and then mudslinging that happens with every election cycle or
Mm.
every new policy proposal or law change because emotion is so powerful and they're effective. Like, I can't cite the particular election, but it was mentioned on Ava DuVernay's documentary 13th, where she's talking about how fear mongering and mudslinging has tended to work in the favor of candidates because, you know, fear is a very primal, strong emotion. So if you're able to tap into people's fear bases and show them why a particular opponent won't keep you safe from basically destruction or death, is what it goes down to. If you look at any of those arguments, right? That crime rates are going up or that, drug use is on the rise. It all goes down, if you boil it down to its most simplistic terms, it hits on those primal fears of death, which from an evolutionary angle, we are like hardwired to like freak out about. So that would be super mobilizing. But I don't think people consciously realize what's happening in the rhetorical context in which those tactics are used in political adverts.
Right. We certainly need better rhetorical literacy in the same way we need more informational literacy. In all of my classes, I always spend a unit talking about fallacies so that we can look at things like fear mongering and understand how they're working. Because
Mm,
if you can't even identify them when they are happening, then you can only be susceptible to them. But if you can say, hey, I can see so and so is trying to get under my skin, or that they are maybe using exaggeration, hyperbolic statements in order to make me feel a way, because if I feel that way, then maybe I'll do something that they want. That's what gives you power over the situation, is being able to identify when that's happening.
yeah. Well, you brought up a couple interesting points when we were prepping for this show around kind of some of the complications that we have to face in this present climate around, appeals to credibility, around logical argumentation, around appeals to emotion. Can you break down for us what you're saying there? Let's just start with credibility.
Yeah, ethos, the appeal to credibility. Well, this is challenging because so much of our interaction with our society, even on a community level, let alone a federal level at this, is so indirect these days, right? We're not face to face with people as much as maybe we could be because of the internet, because of the way workplaces have changed and things like this. And so it's a lot harder for us to vet people's credibility. We have to only go off of what the media tells us a lot of the time. Not only that, so we already have that kind of difficulty in vetting people's credibility, but also we seem to be devolving a little bit, and I don't want this to come across as too pessimistic, but it seems that we are devolving a little bit into this sphere where we maybe have different priorities other than integrity,
Mm,
right? Where maybe we value things as a society such as money and power. And we say, well, if you have those things, then it doesn't matter if you're a good person or a bad person, then you still have authority, right? And that's a warped sense, according to Aristotle, of where that authority should come from.
yeah. And I think that's a really interesting point because there is something to if somebody has money, people look to them as though they did something to earn it in some capacity, which, I mean, we could do a whole episode on this in and of itself.
Yeah.
But there is a lot of privilege that comes with money, and just because somebody has, financial means, it does not create a blanket of credibility in every area in which they wish to speak.
Right. Wealth is not synonymous with morality. And I think people know that,
Mm.
but on a kind of zoomed out scale, it doesn't seem to be the case that that's the priority, right? That we value morality over money or something.
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting too to add into that, and money does tend to intersect with things like celebrity or fame.
Mhm.
But I remember when I was teaching my rhetoric classes, it was always interesting to look at when they would have celebrity spokespersons for different products because they were banking on the recognizability or the credibility of, let's say, a Taylor Swift to promote something, right?
Mhm.
When in reality, um, it is interesting how much trust is given to like public individuals, so much so that it's extended to like, well, if she's speaking for this, I should buy it. without even doing any kind of work to understand why she should be trusted in that space.
Yeah, and this is again a misapplication of the appeal to authority ethos, right? There are people who know how this kinds of things work rhetorically, they are using it in a way to say to make that synonymous, right? If this person likes it, this person was well known, you like this person, therefore you should like this product. I mean, it's a logical fallacy, but it's harder to
Mm,
recognize, right? And I think one thing I've been thinking about recently in terms of what is rhetorically effective is familiarity. I think we are more I mean, this is there's a fallacy name for this, and now I'm blanking on it. But the things that we are more familiar with, we tend to trust more. So you put somebody's face up on a billboard or on MTV. That's a little dated, but on social media, I should say.
yes, we're millennials.
um, you start to be familiar with that person, and familiarity often will breed trust, right?
Mhm,
Because you're comfortable, right? You kind of let your guard down. And
mhm,
so people who are using celebrities to sell products that maybe have nothing to do with them are leaning on this.
right. Oh, a couple things you highlighted that are interesting, the overlap between a breakdown of credibility and logic at the same time.
Yeah.
I think that's a really interesting piece to look at because they're not all sectioned out neatly. Like, there is a lot of overlap between each of these appeals.
Yes. Oh, totally. I'm glad you bring that up because this is also something I like to focus on in my classes is the kind of interdependence of the rhetorical appeals, ethos, pathos, logos, right? And so if somebody starts to lie to you, you find out somebody that you trusted lied to you, well, that's going to undermine their credibility,
Mhm,
right? And so these things go hand in hand. You say, give me, logos, a good argument. If there's misinformation, as we know there is in this day and age on the internet, um, on social media, these kinds of lies, misinformation is so prevalent nowadays because there's profit to be made in it, then how do you make these kinds of judgments, right?
mhm.
Especially when you're not face to face and you can't make those distinctions between is this a trustworthy person or not? This is just coming at you kind of disembodied
Mhm.
almost, right? And so it's almost breaking those interdependence between the appeals where we no longer this information, this language is not coming from someone, so we only have to look at the language itself, and then it's very easy to manipulate.
I think that's I've actually thought about this a lot with AI because I've thought about how AI kind of is given just blanket credibility because we've looked at technology and been like, well, the internet's never wrong, but there's a lot more open source access to all. I mean, again, a lot of different ways we can go with this, but AI clearly has its flaws. It's been shown to like hallucinate, to outright make things up to give you an answer. But and the thing is it justifies its answers even if it's completely misfounded. Like, you have to test the justifications it's giving you. I did a search once with AI, and I asked it to give me results and to cite sources. It made up sources,
Yeah, it does.
outright made up sources. It pulled names of real people that were in, like, similar spaces, but completely made up articles and books that did not exist.
Yeah, and I mean, this is what Socrates was worried about with the written word, because once something's written down, I mean, I guess AI also can talk to you now, right? And it talks or writes so nicely, so eloquently, at least nowadays, it's much better than it used to be. And I think that's partially what gives this false sense of credibility. But it sounds right, you know? And so if you don't have the ability to interrogate that text because you've never been taught methods of interpretation or
Mhm,
analysis, then yes, it sounds nice and therefore you believe it. And this goes back to the very early origins of rhetoric as eloquence, right?
mhm.
Before rhetoric was codified into this practice where we teach people how to speak well in the assembly in order for political gain, it was just the poets who spoke so nicely and we would believe them because it sounded good.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I feel like that's what we see playing out in lots of spaces now, right? Like, we have presidential debates, and what do we focus on the like, when we're critiquing those typically? It's not breaking down typically, it's not breaking down, like, the claims and, like, the reasons and the assumptions behind each of the candidates, but it's, 1, do they look put together? And then 2, do they sound good? Are they charismatic? I mean, we're missing most of the iceberg when that's all we're looking at.
Yeah, that's a great metaphor. We're only seeing the tip of the iceberg there because, in part, the format as well, right? When we're just given a few minutes to respond to a question, you don't really have time to give a solid argument or to go through all the reasons. You just say something that's pithy that will catch attention, be remembered, because again, then maybe it gets soundbited. And that can be positive or negative, but it will breed this familiarity, right? And that will make you start to feel comfortable, like you know this person and that you can trust this person. And it doesn't, again, as you were saying, doesn't have anything to do with what is said, but how they go about saying it.
I guess I would say I'm feeling a sense of overwhelm or hopelessness as to how we use rhetoric in our current social spheres. Words of hope?
Study rhetoric, right? Everyone should study rhetoric. I know that that maybe sounds elitist, maybe, but if you have an internet connection, there's many resources. And there's a reason certain things have been preserved, I think, because they do have value and and they're relevant today as they were relevant thousands of years ago.
Yeah. Well, and I think if we want to break it down even further, it's just learn how to talk to each other and learn how to listen.
Let's take it a step back. Just talk to people. Get out of your house, talk to people, use the spoken word, because this is what Socrates loved about the spoken word, at least according to Plato, is that in the moment, as we're doing here, you can go back, correct, interrogate. Well, what did you mean by that? Right? Whereas you
Mm,
can't do this with the written word,
mm.
right? It's once it's written down, it's kind of stuck in a way. And so we need living dialogue in order to make change.
All right. That is going to wrap up this week's episode of the Thread Work Collective. Thank you so much for Dr. Estee Crenshaw and all of her wisdom and things she's learned about rhetoric and the importance of rhetoric in discourse and ultimately within our democratic and just communal spaces. I really loved her call to action at the end of this episode of just getting up and starting to talk to people, asking questions, being curious. If you want to find Dr. Estee Crenshaw, I'm linking her profile in show notes, and I would love to hear any of your questions, comments, feedback points on this episode as we keep the conversation going. Stick around, and thanks again for listening this week to the Rhetoric Collective on air. You're listening to the Threadwork Collective on air. I'm your host, Liana Jean Manabog, artist, educator, and community builder. This show is where art meets activism, where local voices share the causes that matter to them, and where storytelling becomes a bridge toward understanding and belonging. We highlight the power of creative expression, grassroots action, and healthy dialogue to strengthen our communities. Because shared stories create shared futures.